Greetings, everybody. I'm Ken Yaffe, and I'll be making a presentation today. And this presentation is intended for Colorado Mountain Club Scrambling Course. Today, we're going to be talking about off-trail hazards, specifically traveling on steep, loose rock, which includes talus, scree, hazards of rockfall, loose dirt on steep slopes, all those things that you encounter when you venture off the trail, or what we think of as like class 2 terrain. So with scrambling, we now venture onto class 3 terrain. We're off trail, and the hazards increase significantly. So that's what we're talking about. How can we mitigate some of those risks that we that are now new to us when we start to scramble? And noticing that, there we go. Okay, so disclaimer. Hiking and scrambling in the backcountry and off trail is inherently dangerous. I shouldn't have to tell you that, but it is. If you travel in this terrain, the risk is your own, of course. The information and techniques shared here are intended to be introductory. Nothing is guaranteed to keep you safe from injury, even if you follow these instructions and techniques precisely. So, of course, you're encouraged to seek instruction from a qualified instructor before venturing out on your own into new types of terrain that perhaps you haven't experienced before. So let's talk about the hazard. From accidents in North American climbing, 2018, some of the statistics that I have up here, you'll notice that the immediate cause of injuries, 38% are from falling or slipping on rock. Another 7% from falling rock or ice or other objects. And avalanche, just 3%. You might think that with all the avalanche courses and information out there, that avalanches are a major contributor to accidents when climbing mountains, but actually a greater hazard that impacts a larger number of people are from just traveling on hard rock, whether that's slipping or falling or rocks falling on you. So we're going to focus on those hazards today. To be successful on any trip in the backcountry, it's important to prepare and plan. And obviously, some of the things we can do in terms of preparing are get the training from experienced instructors, other people who have more experience than you. Gain some experience slowly, practice some techniques. Do your route study, check the resources that are out there. They're a great resource. Some people are very generous with their time these days and providing a lot of what we call beta or information on the routes. You'll see in the screen that I have here is from Ellingwood Point. It's a great little slide where the contributor mapped out different options and provided routes or areas that you should absolutely avoid. So go ahead and take advantage of those resources that are out there. When you're planning, you should always have alternate routes. That's especially important during the winter when you're not sure how significant the snow hazard might be, how deep the snow is, exposure to avalanches, etc. And always be prepared with bailout routes. Those routes that you might have to take if you encounter unanticipated hazards. Maybe you misjudged how quickly weather was coming in and you needed to use one of your bailout routes to get back to the trailhead or off a ridge quickly. Bring the right gear. How do you bring the right gear? You anticipate the hazards. If you anticipate rain, what do? You bring a rain shell. Well, same thing if you anticipate that you will be encountering hazardous terrain like steep rocky slopes. Perhaps you will choose different footwear, or you'll bring a helmet, etc. And then estimate the consequences. Try to imagine how bad an accident will be if something goes wrong. So those are all things you can do to help prepare yourself while you're planning. So let's get right into it. First, we'll just start with the easiest. Horizontal talus. What is it? Big, blocky, sharp rocks, large. You'll encounter uneven terrain, Rockers, what's a rocker? A rocker is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to be a big rock that you step on and suddenly it shifts, which of course can throw you off balance and perhaps onto another rock. You have to be aware of verglass. This might be the first time you've heard that term. That's just a thin sheen of ice that's over the rock that you don't notice, and it makes it extremely slippery. And of course, rocks can become slippery due to just moisture, light rain, and snow cover. Sometimes rocks will be covered with lichens, and just the slightest amount of moisture will make them extremely slippery. The additional problem with snow cover is that it will cover up holes and gaps between the talus. And that, of course, introduces another hazard of poke through, where you don't see the hole and your foot goes in between the rocks. And of course, you can lacerate your shin, which we have friends that has happened to, or even worse, perhaps sprain an ankle or break a bone. So these are significant hazards to be aware of, even just on horizontal talus. So how do we mitigate this risk? Well, some techniques we can use is we test the rock. If we're unsure, we step slowly and we test before we step. We plan ahead. Think about where you're going to step. Don't just hop from rock to rock randomly. Try to plan 2 or 3 steps ahead and then deliberately take those steps. Maintain your balance, very important. And also, when you're with other individuals, maintain your spacing. Unlike traveling on a trail, where you're going to have a relatively stable pace, when you're on talus, now your pacing is going to be very variable because you might encounter more significant changes in the terrain. So you don't want to be traveling so close to your partner where they suddenly stop because they have to think about their next step, that you now bump into them and perhaps knock them down. And of course, protective gear. Maybe a helmet is called for. Poles. Let me make a little diversion here about poles. We don't necessarily recommend that you always bring 2 poles because now you've got 4 appendages to worry about, and poles can sometimes get kind of caught up in your feet. But having 1 light pole can be advantageous in this kind of terrain. It just gives you that extra ability to provide that balance. Place that pole on a rock if you need to, if you temporarily lose your balance. Gloves, if you do lose your balance and you have to go down, keep in mind that a lot of these rocks can have sharp edges. So maybe you just want some kind of leather glove to protect your hand. And then finally, footwear. This is going to be a personal preference, but normally we recommend anything from a trail runner to a light mountaineering boot, depending on your personal preference and what you're comfortable hiking in. Moving on to loose, rocky slopes. Well, they're steep, they're unpredictable. You can't always see how the terrain's going to change. They vary a lot, and they can be covered with talus, large blocks, scree, much smaller rocks, or loose dirt. The hazards, well, they're the same as horizontal terrain. Plus, now we have the additional hazard of rockfall, where a rock can become dislodged either naturally or by a hiker above you or perhaps wildlife above you. And of course, if you slip and fall on a steep slope, you now have the additional hazard of continuing to fall and magnifying the consequences of that fall. So some things to be aware of when we're encountering steep, rocky slopes. Keep in mind that heavy rains and springtime freeze-thaw cycles will make a lot of these rocks looser and will increase the hazard. We can mitigate some of that by climbing areas prone to rockfall earlier in the day before they've had chance to thaw. And this is going to be more in the shoulder seasons, more in the springtime. Test rock stability and quality. Interact with your environment. Watch, listen, really be observant about what the rock is doing. Keep in mind that rocks will collect on ledges. Again, you might feel confident walking on a ledge, but be aware that the ledge may have actually an increased number of loose rocks to navigate. Fresh talus or damaged vegetation could be indications of recent rockfall. And again, that could just alert you to the fact that you want to keep your head up and be looking for more rockfall. Ridges are generally more stable. Not always, but generally they are. So again, use your resources, seek out that data, seek out that additional information as to whether or not it's better to traverse a slope or to gain the ridge and stay on the ridge. Lichens or soil around rocks may indicate greater stability. Something to keep in mind when you're making your choices on where to travel. And then finally, warn others about loose rocks. If you encounter them and you have your team behind you, let them know that you've encountered it. Watch for other parties, as I mentioned before, including wildlife above you and below you. And speaking of other parties, consider the right of way. Perhaps you're ascending a slope and another party is descending it. Who has the right of way? Well, it's best to communicate with that party, especially if there's a risk or a hazard of rockfall, and stay clear and decide who's going to work that gully first. Typically, the right of way goes to the ascending party, but again, it's best. That's not a hard and fast rule. It's best to communicate with that other party and stay out of the fall line. What can you do individually to walk up these slopes? First, tighten your boots. That's something we don't always do, but this, you might have started off on the trail. Your boots are a little loose. When you encounter the more difficult terrain, take the extra couple of minutes and tighten your boots. Take smaller steps. Don't shuffle your feet. Shuffling feet is a major cause of rockfall, as is sitting or sliding with loose gear on your packs while descending. This is a key skill that I like to emphasize in scrambling. Maintain weight on stationary foot throughout the move. And that might not make initial sense right off the bat, but I want you to think about that one. It's like the anti-dino move. If you're into climbing, you know what a dino is, where you kind of leap from one position to the next. And this is exactly the opposite of that. This is really maintaining weight on that foot that you're stepping with until you're ready to transition your weight to the next step. Very important in scrambling, extremely important when you're on loose or hazardous terrain. Try following the leader's route as close as possible. This way, especially if they're choosing a good route and they're not encountering a lot of loose rock, the more you spread out from that, the greater chance that you have of finding that loose rock that you might dislodge. Push down or press in on holes instead of pulling out. If you find yourself off route, stop, evaluate, and return if required. Okay, what can we do as a group? Most importantly, know your route. The overriding principle that we want to follow is minimizing our exposure to the fall line. That's going to be the number one thought that you want to keep in mind when you're navigating these gullies and this loose rock, and you're with a group. We have a couple of different techniques that I'll go through, and the specific technique is going to be dependent on the group size, and the route features. And finally, agree on your rock protocols with your group. So first, we'll start with short, narrow path. The best technique to use here is, if it's short and narrow, go one at a time to a safe spot. It can be time consuming, so it's better with smaller groups. Sometimes there can be communication challenges. Even if it's short, if the wind is blowing, that can hamper communication. So again, knowing your route, maybe this is a good one to consider if you're going to encounter this, to bring radios. For long and narrow gullies, you want to employ an ascending or descending traverse. And I'll get into a little more of that in a little bit. If traversing is difficult, exposure to the fall line may be unavoidable. So it's important, therefore, to travel close together, move slowly, and test all rocks. The last bullet I have here is for all you science and engineering individuals. That's kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. And you'll notice that the velocity squared is the key point. We want to avoid getting hit by a fast-moving rock, small or large. And that's the reason why we travel close together. So that if the individual in front of you does dislodge a rock, it's moving at its slowest when it does hit you. Obviously, if you're traveling in the fall line at a distance and it hits you, it has time to pick up speed and do a lot of damage. So that's why we emphasize traveling close together in these situations. Here's just a simple animation of how we traverse. Notice that we stay out of the fall line if we assume the fall line is straight down, and we go to a place of protection. We then get ready to move to the next area of protection. And this is how we can optimize our safety, minimize our exposure to the risk of falling rock. Keep in mind that there's a line of sight limitation when you're in these gullies. Slopes appear steeper from below. And I like to think of this as, if you've ever gone down to Manitou Springs to climb the incline, as you're driving past it on I-25, the first time you see it, it appears almost straight up. And it can be psychologically impairing. Oh my God, how am I going to do that? But then when you're on it, you're like, oh, okay, it's not as steep as it appeared from below. But more insidious, slopes appear less steep from above. And that can inadvertently lead you down into terrain or down a gully where you suddenly get cliffed out, where the steepness increases gradually until it's to a point where you can't maintain your footing, and perhaps you can't even reverse your path. And that may seem obvious, again, in the classroom, like, oh yeah, I'll never do that. But consider that it may not be so apparent when you're on an exposed ridge above tree line and a storm is bearing down on you. Then it might be very tempting to jump into that gully that doesn't appear so steep. So keep that in mind. Again, you can mitigate a lot of this by doing a careful route study and understanding where your alternate and bailout routes are and what the nature of those routes are. The last one is open and wide, loose rocky slopes that are just open and wide. And here we just ascend or descend in parallel, or for those who speak French, en echelon. And this is just spreading out and dispersing across the slope, again, staying out of the fall line. The big risk here is that people will travel at different rates, and inadvertently, an individual will enter into the fall line. So be aware of your travel partners and try to stay relatively close in terms of your progress up or down the slope. Okay, we'll move on next to the rockfall protocol. What do you do in the event you do dislodge a rock or someone else notices a rock is falling? Well, the most important thing is just yell out, rock, rock, rock. If you see it, yell it loudly and repeatedly, typically 3 times, but keep yelling it, okay, until it's not a hazard anymore. It's not a risk to your party. Point at it. If you're the one who sees it, point at it, because there may be other hikers that are in the area that aren't necessarily familiar with these protocols, and they're going to look at you when you start yelling rock. And if they do look at you, you're giving them the chance by pointing at that rock to see the hazard and give them an opportunity to move from it and protect themselves. Yell clear when the hazard's passed. If you hear a rock and don't immediately see it, don't look for it, because by the time you see it, it may be too late to actually protect yourself. Don't panic. Abrupt moves on unstable terrain increases your risk of falling. So again, be deliberate, know what you're going to do ahead of time. And what you're going to do is flatten yourself against the slope or nearby rock, or duck below an overhang if it's nearby. Nearby meaning arm's length. We don't want to start attempting to run for cover. Chances are you don't have the time to do it. And again, because you're in a semi-panic state of mode, you're increasing that risk of falling or tripping. You want to expose the top of your helmet to the apparent fall line, because if unfortunately the rock does hit us, we want it to hit the helmet. And if we put our heads down, we're now exposing the back of our head or our neck. Speaking of neck, protect your neck with your pack or hands if able. Be aware that a single rock can also trigger a rock avalanche, or if it's a large rock and it hits other large rocks, it can break apart, and now you have multiple rocks coming down at you. And the path of these will be very unpredictable. So trying to game it and jump out at the last minute, is a risky gamble. So the most important thing to do is protect yourself. Keep in mind that hikers below you may call rock that's falling above you. So just because you hear a rock from someone below you doesn't mean that you are not at risk. You may be at risk. So be aware of that. Take the same precautions if you hear someone yell rock who's below you. Okay, moving on to the next terrain type or hazard we might encounter, scree. Scree is very small rocks on a slope. And ascending scree can be very slow and very difficult, almost like climbing a sand dune. Sometimes you can descend scree via a standing glissade technique if it's not too steep and the scree is deep. If you don't understand this is something to discuss with your instructors while you're out there, and they can demonstrate this technique for you, and it'll help expedite your descent down a scree-filled slope. Use your boot edges for stability. Control your speed. Don't go too fast. Again, you want to maintain balance. Consider lightweight gaiters. They can be useful for keeping that scree out of your boots. And also especially beware of very small scree on hard slabs. It's almost as bad as solid ice. And if you're going to encounter that, consider the possibility of microspikes. I have used microspikes before when I knew beforehand that I was going to encounter some steep slopes that had a lot of scree, and they can be very helpful in those situations. Nevado de Toluca in Mexico, the finest scree in the land. Yeah, so I just had to throw that in there. It really was, it's volcanic, and it really was very deep and steep. We probably spent an hour at least coming down that one gully. Couple of points about a helmet to wear or not to wear. When we're in the club, when we're participating on club hikes, we are required to wear them when the terrain is class 4 or above. When we're in class 3, they're strongly recommended. Of course, there have been objections to wearing helmets in the past. People still have objections to wearing them. I actually find them comfortable, and I'll leave them on. I'll leave the helmet on for much of a route, even when the hazard is no longer there. They are affordable, they're lightweight, they're comfortable. Consider wearing them if you're going to be crossing talus, you're going to be encountering steep, rocky slopes like we've discussed here today. You may be exposed to rockfall. Or if you're planning on any high-speed travel, like glissading, or if you're bringing along sharp gear, like crampons or an ice axe, that typically implies steep terrain and the chance of a fall. So again, that's where a helmet is normally indicated. You may think that your route doesn't include any of these features. Well, the question is that you need to address is, how familiar are you with the route and contingencies? Is there a possibility that you may have to bail out on one of those features? So again, give very careful consideration to bringing a helmet. So in summary, just some key points. It's important to prepare and plan, understand where you're going and where you might encounter these hazards. While you're out there, observe how the terrain changes around you and change your techniques to match that terrain and the hazards, to mitigate those risks. Modify your travel techniques. Move deliberately and slowly. Interact with the terrain, test it. Don't just hop from rock to rock carelessly. Avoid exposure to the fall line when you're on that steep, rocky terrain. On horizontal terrain, increase your spacing. And as the slope increases, decrease your spacing and decrease your speed. So that's basically it. Again, hiking and scrambling in the backcountry, off trail is inherently dangerous. So do your due diligence. If you're unfamiliar with terrain, go with someone more experienced. Go get some training from qualified instructors. And I think that's all I have for you today. Hope this was worthwhile, and we'll see you out there in the backcountry.